Hey there. Before you are about to dive into one of the episodes from our maternal mental health series, make sure that you have subscribed to our podcast on Spotify, the podcast, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like this episode, we would appreciate if you spread the word and recommend or even forward this episode or the whole podcast in general to another parent or to anyone who you think should be listening to this. If you find yourself asking, how can you support us? The easiest way to do this is to give us a follow on Instagram at Damn Parenting Podcast and to rate us with 5 stars on the platform that you're listening to this. We hope you know you're not alone on this parenting journey and you enjoy the following episode. Let's get started.
Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Damn Parenting, your English-speaking parenting podcast from Amsterdam, the Netherlands. As always, we are your hosts, Eva and
Maren.
And today we are delighted to welcome Emma. Hi, Emma.
Hi.
Hi. Emma is actually an ADHD coach in training. She actually lives in Haarlem, and you will hear her voice this month as well, as she will be sharing her birth story. But right now, she's actually on today as we wanted to discuss basically the connection and repercussions that mothers can actually face if you have been diagnosed with ADHD, but equally if you even guess or suspect that you might have ADHD and are a mother and struggling to manage life, basically, as it were. So Emma, let's just get straight into it. Can you explain any connection between ADHD and mothering and what's involved in that, how show itself, I guess?
Yeah, sure. So what often happens is prior to becoming a mother, we have unknowingly develop lots of coping mechanisms for ourselves. Then we have children and we throw this whole new world into our life that has a lot of organization and trying to remember routines and all of this. And we can't cope, basically. So what tends to happen is someone who's managed to kind of keep their head above water suddenly can't because it's just got too much. And particularly if we don't really understand our ADHD or don't know we have it, that then can turn into a lot of internalized shame about ourselves as a mother and who we are, and kind of really manifest in this emotional overwhelm and sometimes depression and anxiety as well.
Which isn't really a great addition to what we're already going through in motherhood with hormones.
I'm also hearing a lot of loneliness in this because it's already so hard when you're not on any kind of special neurodivergent spectrum, and that is already so much. And then you hear about people and you hear them and then you think, but mine is so much worse. Like you feel so isolated, I can only imagine, because you're already in this isolated group and then it's another layer on top that you have to overcome. And when you were talking there of that you have coping mechanisms throughout your life and then you get thrown into this totally unknown, it's just like a constant, like it's like a child in an elevator that just presses all the buttons up and down, up and down, up and down all the time. That's what I can imagine it must feel like. And yeah, that sounds very, very challenging.
Yeah, well, you're right, because there's the two sort of key parts, because one is the executive functioning of like keeping everything going. You know, this sounds really weird, but when you have ADHD, you can't form a habit in the way that neurotypical people can. So every day you're having to try and remember those vitamin drops. And then every day being shown, oh yeah, you forgot again. I mean, that's my very real reality. You know, you have this very explicit awareness of what you're not managing to do, which is really, really challenging. And the other side is ADHD is also self-regulation of emotions. And without trying to make it too complex, our window of tolerance before getting put into our stress reaction is smaller and emotions flood us. So you've got a child screaming at you, you're struggling to kind of keep on top of stuff. And just all of that is just such an intense experience. And you've never been taught how to self-regulate that emotion.
Yeah, it's not very easy for being in motherhood without ADHD. That's already a struggle in itself, where a lot of us have big T's or little T traumas or experiences or not learning our regulation as well. Can you actually then just explain some common challenges that moms with ADHD will face managing their own mental health?
Yeah, so I think the key challenges that we see is one, and I think what I'd like to point out is I think it's a more intense version of what lots of mothers experience. So as I share this, it's not saying if you have this, you definitely have ADHD, because I
It's like
always think
amplified.
it's on
Yeah.
the far end of the scale.
Yeah.
So I really think overwhelm is kind of the key emotional description I would use, because it's that duck analogy, like the swan analogy, where they're graceful on top and then they're really pedaling viciously under the water. And life can really feel like that you are trying to keep all these balls in the air and you just can't. It's really, really tough when you have all this additional stuff. So you could just get overwhelmed in that. We also have this tendency to obviously compare ourselves to others. And when you have ADHD and you don't understand it, so either you don't have that diagnosis or you have the diagnosis and actually someone still never taught you what it really is, you often look to others to define who you are, because you don't trust yourself. When you've done well, it feels a bit like luck because you don't understand how you operate. So we're constantly looking to others to define us. And then that can be really, really damaging on our perception of self and how we feel. And then adding that mothering part in, where we feel we're not coping, where we're feeling these big emotions, and it can all pile on top and just make us feel not very good as a mother. And I think the other part where for me it really became a challenge is the emotional regulation, because as you mentioned with the small t traumas adding up to a big trauma, when we've had that our whole life, as I said before, our window of tolerance is really small. So what that means is we are just put into our fight or flight really quickly. We very quickly feel we can't do something and we don't know what we need to be able to cope, because no one's ever taught us to identify our needs or understand our needs or ask for our needs, right? So we can constantly find ourselves going from almost one drama to the next of this stress reaction. And then that compounds over time in exhaustion and, like I say, depression and anxiety.
And then
Yeah,
you trying, while this happens, you of course try to parent and teach your child all of that, how good it is to regulate, how good all this is. So it's like, I imagine you either can feel like, oh, I'm lying, I'm lying, I'm lying. Like, what am I saying? Or I'm an imposter, like this whole layer. Or you like, yeah, but this is how normal people do it. And this is like, oh, yeah,
it's a blind
And
person teaching someone to
yeah,
read, basically.
yeah,
and
exactly.
and you got to remember it's a highly hereditary condition. So if you have
Mm,
ADHD, there's a very good chance you're also
hmm.
parenting a child with ADHD, which means they're also having,
They're
up to
like, lady,
30%
what are
impairment
you
in
doing?
their executive functioning and self-regulation.
Oh.
So, you potentially, depending on presentation, but you could also have a slightly more, the Dutch like to call it pittig child. So spicy child.
So you were mentioning there already about exhaustion being a symptom of ADHD and caring for your child and managing your daily responsibilities as such. Such an example that kind of resonates with me, I guess, is like the other day, it was really sunny and I just was honestly just exhausted and I couldn't imagine myself getting on the bike, going to the park or doing anything. And I just couldn't do anything. So exhaustion is one example. The ramifications would be basically of undiagnosed or unmedicated or untreated ADHD. Would you be able to give some other examples so that some other people might be able to identify with anything else?
Yeah, I think as I touched before, like the shame side is really crucial. And I think this is where intersectionality is also really important, because ADHD is ADHD. How it presents in you, depending on your intersectionality, really then alters things. And as women and then as mothers, there are all these expectations of what that person means. And when we have ADHD, it can often feel that who we are is really far away from the societal expectation of a woman, of a mother. And so actually shame, like really feeling that we are not good enough, but sort of like damaged. So the way I always describe it, it's like you're born or you become a mother and you're told this is the manual of how to be a mother. And you're constantly looking at it saying, yeah, but I don't work like that. That's not how I operate. But if you've never been told you were given the wrong manual, you just think you are broken. And then you're trying so hard, right? So and this is women in general, but I think there's an added layer nuance with ADHD, is we are often perfectionists and people pleasers because we believe our inner core is damaged in some way. So we have to create behaviors to mask the kind of person we're afraid we are. And I think when we become mothers, that particularly gets compounded, this kind of shame, people pleasing, perfectionist cycle, because we don't trust and know who we are at our core.
That's punching me in the gut, Maren.
Wow. Jeez. That's heavy. That is very, very heavy. And I'm so glad that we're having this conversation because this is such a brutal honesty that I appreciate, because I think this is something, if someone really feels truly that way, I don't know, like, who do you share this with? Like, who do you trust with this information that this person will be by your side and will carry you and will not be like, oh God, I gotta get the fuck out of here, kind of. So I appreciate it so much that you share this, and that hopefully if someone out there hears this, knows they're not alone, and someone hears you and there is a space for that. So thank you.
But we're not ending there. I have still some more questions for you.
Yeah, but I just wanted to, it's really nice.
It sounded so ending there.
No. I don't want this to end. I just wanted to really say thank you that we have people like you in the community who really are not scared of sharing this. And so we all feel supported.
Yeah. So taking the next step then, let's talk about some strategies or coping mechanisms, I guess, that you might be able to recommend for moms to help improve their mental well-being.
Yeah. So the thing that always comes up for me with mothers, actually, whether you have ADHD or not, is first of all, empathy for self, right? Because I mean, particularly in this day and age, we have unsustainably high expectations of parenting, regardless if you have ADHD or not. And most of us are trying our best, whatever that looks like, and that can be very variable and different. So I think developing that empathy for self is really important. I think the reason I'm very pro ADHD diagnosis is because when we don't understand what ADHD means, and actually I think it's beyond diagnosis, I think it's true understanding of ADHD, we struggle with that empathy for self because we're still looking at ourselves through a neurotypical lens. We're still often existing in this place of I should be able to, or I should just, and that's just not true. Your brain is fundamentally wired differently. Your brain is not there to be fixed because it can't. So yeah, I think developing that empathy for self, and if you can with that ADHD lens, is really, really important, first of all. And then I think pausing for awareness. So something we always teach is learning to pause, because if you have an ADHD brain, it's 100 miles an hour, it's everywhere and anywhere. And to thrive, you need to understand your needs. That's a human thing, that in order for us to thrive, we have to know our needs. But most of us can't even identify our needs. So in order to do that, we have to learn the practice of pausing, however simple that looks, to just be able to start asking ourselves, what's going on here? So when you're in overwhelm with your children, when you're completely like, I can't be here, I want to run away, which, I have been many times, rather than immediately going to judgment and going, I shouldn't be feeling like this and all of that kind of narrative, you go, okay, why am I feeling like this? What is going on for me? And what do I need? What do I need right now? And start creating that kind of curious language with yourself is, in my opinion, the thing that we can do that single-handedly really shifts going from this constant place of almost like one drama after another to, okay, I can start writing this manual for myself, because I know if I have no adult contact when I'm looking after my children, I get to that end of the day and I'm basically having an anxiety attack on the floor because my energy has been completely drained. I'm completely understimulated and overstimulated simultaneously. And so I understand this is what I need to make my day good. And this is how I can go and get those things. So yeah, needs identification, I think, is really important. And the other thing I've learned to do quite a lot, and again, I don't think it's just an ADHD thing, is this whole parental expectation thing, is in this world of perfectionism. And I do this actually with my business and as a parent. It's what does good enough look like? So rather than what should I be doing, what does good enough look like? And I create some form of intention with maximum 3 things about what does good enough look like. Then I can say, okay, that's manageable, that's achievable, that I can explore and work with, because otherwise we're just constantly looking at that gap between where we are and where we think we should be, which, it's painful, right? And that's not a good place to parent from, this really painful place.
So you just mentioned there a parenting technique about what is good enough, which I think is actually, we've mentioned it many times before actually with Dr. Naomi about, the good enough psychologist, the good enough parent. And I think that's actually quite nice to hear it now becoming more frequent. And hopefully this is going to, resonate with a lot more people and calibrate within. Are there any other parenting techniques which can be beneficial for us?
So the other thing I think, particularly when we have ADHD, that's really important is anything that helps with self-regulation, because essentially we're often very dysregulated, and that's where the real challenge lies. So as I mentioned before, the kind of pausing, and then what you can do with that is different techniques. So breathing, which you've probably talked to other people about before, but finding a breathing technique that just calms allows you to feel back in control and calming yourself, so that you can bring yourself back to present to explore what do I need or what needs to happen next, but taking that space. The other thing that can be really helpful for ADHD is music. ADHD and music is linked in a number of ways from a dopamine perspective. So we're constantly wired for interest. So if we can bring dopamine in, that's really helpful. But also music can help us pace, because we have things like time blindness and our effort. We work in sprints, not marathons. So we don't know how to necessarily always regulate our effort. So music can be a really helpful way to either regulate the pace at which you're doing something or regulate yourself emotionally. So, for example, I know a girl who puts earbuds in when she's doing the bedtime routine because she finds it really, really triggering and emotionally dysregulating. So by putting in music that helps her and remain calmer and regulate her own emotion, she can get through that sort of challenging period of the day much easier. So we can use things like that. And with that dopamine idea in mind, it's what gives you dopamine, right? Like your brain is wired for interest. It's not wired for importance. So how can you make the parts of your day that are really boring, because there's a lot of parenting that is really boring and lonely, how can you make that more interesting for yourself? How can you find that dopamine? For me, that's very social contact in whatever sense that means. But the more you can start understanding, I thrive when, my energy is best managed when, the more you can thrive. So another example I've heard a lot of that is really helpful for me is if I just say I'm going to the playground, my body is like, well, I don't know how to manage that effort. Like that could go on forever. Like my body doesn't realize that that's a certain period of time. And so it doesn't know how to sustain its energy for going to the playground. If, on the other hand, you say, I'm going to the playground and we are going to leave at 11 o'clock, I can then start teaching my own body on how to regulate its energy and emotions to kind of, for want of a better word, get through that, rather than it being this incredibly painful experience that just feels it will never end.
Yeah, which is helpful for any parent, because that's how I feel about those things.
That actually reminds me.
Though,
of the thing I mentioned a while ago about one therapist a while ago said to me kind of like, everything is always an elephant, but you got to learn to take the baby, like the mice steps to be able to tackle everything. So like I have this checklist in my head of a whole routine. It's like, well, if I get through this, that's a success. Now, what's the next thing to keep going? Because I have to keep ticking these off to be able to achieve that big elephant of whatever it is. So yeah, the next question is actually going to be an important one, I guess, for many of us out there is how can a support network or community be beneficial for us mothers with ADHD?
Yeah, so it's sort of shown that loneliness is one of the things that will make your ADHD worse. And lots of people need community. That's a pretty standard human need. But when we have ADHD, that really can make quite a significant difference on a few levels. One, for that social connection, because we often thrive with social connection, but also having other people involved in our life actually can help our executive function. So communicating to someone else is often how we process our information, because we're often external processors. So that in itself can help us think, oh, what is it? Just talking can help us learn to create executive function. It can help us work out what we're trying to prioritize, or, so there's that side that actually it makes your ADHD often easier from an executive function. And there is that sense of connection and belonging and feeling seen. And I am now much more heavily involved in ADHD communities. And the most beautiful experience of that is realizing I'm not the weird person who seems to struggle more than everyone else. I'm not the kind of outsider where no one quite seems to get me. So I think it's really, really important to have that community, to just know you're not alone, to know your challenges are experienced by others, but also to learn how you can thrive. That external processing and sharing of ideas and information, that's where ADHDers thrive. Like, we thrive in ideas and sharing and joining dots and all of that. And, however negative, for want of a better word, a lot of this conversation has sounded, I really do believe we can thrive with ADHD. I believe it's learning to change that narrative from kind of like, I can't do whatever, to I can, and this is what I need. And that's where this community helps you come in, because you start learning, what is it I need? Like, I'm going to start writing this manual for myself that no one's ever told me. We need those other people to kind of just have that knowledge and awareness and, feel understood and be part of a community where we don't need to explain ourselves or feel awkward or feel too much or too sensitive.
And where you also get tips that work.
Yeah, rather than just have a planner. Yeah, great. Yeah. Haven't tried that one, have I?
Which one? The one I bought this week, last month? Like, yeah. I gotta get a brand new one to make it all official and to start perfect again.
Or the whiteboard I'm going to use every day and I haven't touched.
Oh, yeah. So those are some of the tips. So speaking on a kind of more medical kind of way, what role does the medication play in managing our symptoms and improving our maternal mental health?
Yeah. So as I said, I'm not a doctor. So I say this part from lived experience and, awareness through my own training. But so medication, if it's a stimulant, which is the first line of treatment, that's increasing your dopamine, right? So that just means that your brain isn't having to seek that dopamine all the time, and therefore it can improve its executive functioning if it works for you. It doesn't necessarily work for everyone, unfortunately, but for those that it does, it can be a really exceptional change, because you're just not having, going back to that swan analogy, you're just not having to work so hard to just remember, how do I make a sandwich? Where do these clothes go? How many steps are involved in doing the laundry? All those kind of things. There are also options that sit in the dopamine antidepressant space, and they can particularly help on the emotional regulation side. So improving that dopamine, so your emotional regulation is a bit more stable. And then beyond kind of medication, there's obviously like therapy to start understanding it. And as I keep saying about understanding your own manual and understanding your own lens, that's why I think that support from an ADHD angle is so essential, because otherwise you're still living and judging in this world of a neurotypical lens.
Yeah, that's why like the group support or knowing other mothers who are going through it as well is extremely helpful. Are there any resources, books, websites, support groups, or anything else you can recommend to mothers who have suspected ADHD, who have ADHD, who don't even have it and just want to improve their mental health?
Sure. So the only parenting book that I will listen to, and it's because I think we live in this world of high expectations, and I think it can add, is one called Parenting for Humans. And that's written by a psychologist who last year got diagnosed with autism and ADHD. And she actually wrote this book before those diagnoses, to my knowledge. But it's really written from this place of how the expectations are damaging your mental health as a mother, and how you can start creating parenting really your way rather than all these ways that you've been told, and the kind of more messy, complex version of parenting that just works for you and your family. And I found it quite a refreshing approach that didn't just add more shoulds onto my own expectation as a parent.
Good to hear. Actually, I've never heard of that one. So definitely be checking that out. Wrapping up, let's look at what advice would you actually give moms who are struggling with feelings of the guilt, overwhelm, anxiety, just related in general, I guess, to parenting and daily life?
One thing I always say to people is guilt means that you did something wrong, okay? Most of the time we're feeling this guilt, not for doing something wrong, but we're feeling it when we're maybe making a choice to put our own needs as a priority. And that isn't something to feel guilty about. That's something maybe we're socialized to feel guilty about. But a bit like boundaries, we can only serve others at a point. We need to have like our energy available to us to meet someone. So a boundary, for example, isn't this big brick wall. It's the point at which we're available to meet others. And I think applying that into motherhood, it's like, I can only show up as a mother if I'm meeting my own needs first. That's why I come back all the way through to this idea of just pausing and learning to have this awareness and asking yourself, what do I need? And building up this narrative to know what your needs are and know that they're okay, and then learning how to advocate for them for yourself, however unconventional that might look.
It's very interesting that you said this about the boundaries and how oftentimes it feels like we picture it as this big wall, like unovercomable, like it's like we are in this castle. Yeah. And
I mean,
my therapist gave me a very beautiful picture, which I started working with, as she said, you know what? You're like this beautiful house in the countryside, and there's this beautiful lawn in front of you, all these flowers, beautiful path, and then there's this nice little fence, cute little garden fence, has a nice little door, and this is where your boundary is. And isn't that a nicer picture? So you can see people, and you can open this little gate as much as you want. Sometimes it's a little more open, but you can still see through, and it's still there. And I was like, sounds nice, nicer than this brick wall. So really picturing your inner. And then it's like, of course I'm gonna protect it, because I don't want anyone to like stomp over my nice flower beds in here if they can't behave. So that's really, then you see the importance of, you want to keep this nice and you want to keep your mental health in check, then those little fences can be life-saving.
And it's a kind thing to do, because if you're not, then you do things from this place of resentment and expectation and other emotions that aren't helpful for you or them. I think having that in mind when you think about parenting, what do I need to be able to show up in this role?
We're going to wrap it up here. So if anyone has any interest or suspected ADHD, you've been diagnosed in a different country, whatever it might be, the Netherlands does have a different rule. And one of the things that you should know about is it's not a simple case of going to your house arts to say, hey, can I go get diagnosed? They do kind of need you to maybe have seen a therapist before, who then can actually say, I suspect you to have it. And they would then need to then put that to the house arts, and then you'll be then forwarded. There are a couple of different centrums in the Netherlands that you can actually go to. First, note that you will probably need to get a therapist first to have the suspicion, refer you to your house arts, who will then refer you to this. There can be a long waiting list. I've heard it could be like 9 months to 12 months, maybe. So, it's something to take into consideration, that if it's suspected, why not just go now and ask for it? And I mean, in the coming months, maybe if you are with a therapist, they might say, actually, maybe you don't, and then you can always cancel it. But do take care of yourself and do think about it. There's a great resource here in the Netherlands. It's covered by your insurance usually as well, just to even get checked out. There are locations around the Netherlands. So, I mean, it's not always going to be right beside you, but there'll be something accessible. But Emma, thank you so much for joining us. Emma is an ADHD coach, and you'll be able to find all her resources on our show notes and on social medias as well. So thank you again, Emma, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.